And we're live. Hello, book lovers. Welcome to the 144th episode of Authors Love Bookstores, broadcasting here on A Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Kimberly Hensle Lowrance. If you're new to the Blaze, welcome. We are a group of volunteer creatives who host online literary events to support books, authors, and the wider publishing community. Here on Authors Love Bookstores, my co-host Joe Moldover and I bring you conversations between authors and their favorite indie booksellers to shine a light on storytelling, creativity, and bookstores, the small businesses that enrich and enliven our communities. Since we began back in April 2020, we featured bookstores in every U.S. state, plus Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., Canada, and the United Kingdom. Today, we're in the Empire State, New York, specifically New York City, even more specifically Chinatown. Let me introduce you to our guests. So we are joined by Ava Chin. Ava is a fifth-generation Chinese-American New Yorker, and she's the author of the narrative nonfiction MOTT STREET, a Chinese-American family's story of exclusion and homecoming. It's an intimate portrayal of the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a law in place in the United States from 1882 to 1943, and its impact on her four generations of her family as they attempted to lay down roots in America. It's such a good book. I'm so thrilled that we were having Ava here and we can talk about the book today. Ava is a professor, a journalist. She's also the author of the award-winning Eating Wildly, which is a prize-winning novel. It was one of Library Journal's best books of 2014. It was a Goodreads Choice Award book. Kirkus described it as a delectable feast of the heart. She's also an editor of Split: Stories from a Generation Raised on Divorce, which book list called brave and insightful. She's written for the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Village Voice, the list goes on and on and on. She's received fellowships. She's a former slam poet. She has a PhD. I mean, this bio is like an entire page. So impressive. And I should say that Ava is also a professor of creative nonfiction and journalism at the City University of New York Graduate Center and the College of Staten Island. Ava is joined today by Lucy Yu. Lucy is the founder and owner of You and Me Books, the New York City Chinatown's first Asian American female-owned bookstore. Yay! You and Me Books is a bookstore, cafe, and bar that focuses on strong, diverse voices and immigrant stories. It has been a goal to get Lucy on the show for as long as her bookstore's been open. So we are delighted to have both of you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Yay.
So excited.
So I have a bunch of questions for our guests, but to our audience, I hope you will ask your questions as well. Feel free to drop them as a comment below the broadcast and we'll get to as many as we can later on. So Lucy, we're going to start with you. Congratulations on starting You and Me Books. So the store opened in 2021, received a lot of wonderful press. We're going to include it below. You've had such great support from the community, but you've had a really tough year, especially this summer has been extremely challenging. Can you tell our audience what happened and where you are now with your bookstore?
Yeah, it's definitely been a tough year. So on July 4th, I was working in the store, and unfortunately, I was there when we suffered a fire from my neighbors upstairs that forced the shutdown of the store. And it was smoke and water damage that really destroyed almost all of our inventory, in addition to the store overall. I also lost one of my neighbors. Unfortunately, he passed away. And it's been a really, really hard time. And I think that there's never a moment where I thought I would fall, but there were a lot of times when I got very tired. So I think even with that, like even with these hard times, I feel so much love and support from the community. I have been with so many people that have like, okay, you're tired, like let's walk this together. Like I don't have to do all of this alone. And that's shifting my mentality in the way that I first initially started the business, in which I was like, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to get this to be up and running. And that meant working 2 jobs at the time. And now I don't know, it's been like it's a lot of emotions because I feel a lot of devastation, but I also feel a lot of love, and both in the extreme ends of it. And I don't think you can have one without the other. So they're very much tied to each other. And where we are now, so I'm at the new store right now. We're finishing up the setup. We're getting all the books on the walls, and just a bunch of women of color building bookshelves together, getting a new bookstore up and running. Our grand reopening for this temporary space, which we'll have to the end of the year, is on September 11th. I'm sorry, September 16th. Oh my gosh, September 16th. And I'm really excited for it. I think we're all feeling very, very hopeful, very tired, but we're eating a lot of food, so that's keeping us going.
I am really struck by your comment that I don't have to do this alone, that you feel a lot of love. And one of the things that you very wisely did after this tragedy happened is you started a GoFundMe, which, I mean, a necessity in this circumstance. And I checked this morning, and as of this morning, you had over 7,000 or just about 7,000 donations, totaling over $364,000.
It's absolutely bonkers to me because I don't know. I think that I may have spent a lot of my life feeling small or feeling like my dreams are insignificant. And like, I'm an engineer by trade, and I'm opening up a bookstore in the middle of a pandemic. Like, that's just cuckoo bananas. And like, I don't know. I think it means it's a big shock, and it is taking a lot of time for me to process that the dream that I had means a lot to other people too. And like, you know, I see Ava there all the time at the store. Like, I've seen her throughout the whole end of the process of her writing MOTT STREET. Her coming in like after hours of writing and just being like, hey, like, you know, to us just talking about the history of Chinatown. And I am standing on the shoulders of giants of these families that have lived there. And I that's why this like was so important for me to talk about MOTT STREET, because this, and sometimes I have the issue with the word resilience because we didn't choose to be resilient, but we have to be. But that perseverance and that dedication to say that, like, hey, my bookstore, I'm going to find a way to stay here. It's not going to look exactly like everyone expects, but I'm going to keep pushing and I'm not going to fall down. Like, that's part of our story. That's part of our story of like Asian American immigration.
Yeah. That's so true. Tell us, Ava, about Lucy says you're there all the time. So what is it about this bookstore that has meant so much to you? When we invited you, Lucy was the only person you wanted to talk to.
Yeah.
Why? What is it about Lucy and the store and the community that she's created that speaks to you?
So it's kind of hard to put into words how important Lucy's bookstore, how important You and Me Books is to the community. I've mentioned it before to you, Lucy. Like, I didn't realize just how much we needed a bookstore like yours in the neighborhood until you showed up. And the whole thing really, you know, it did seem kind of crazy, right? Start a bookstore in the middle of a pandemic, right? And I know that you had people who were like, you can't do this, right? And yet, you know, I heard that, you know, just within a couple of months, you were able, you know, like, people love the bookstore so much. So many people were coming through and buying from you. You know, we needed, you know, readers needed this literature and they needed this space to be able to like come to. Especially, I think a lot of Asian Americans and others too, outside of the community, right? Coming into Chinatown, your bookstore is one of the destinations in the community, you know? So it's just been phenomenal. And I mentioned to you the really sad thing. So I'm talking to you from the building where my family has lived for generations, since the building was built over 100 years ago. And I was away when the fire happened at your bookstore. And I had heard about it. You know, it was, you know, I was out of the country. It was upsetting, learning about it, you know, just, hearing about it from afar was upsetting. And then I came back to the studio and I looked out of one of my windows here And I saw that the building was all boarded up, and I didn't realize that one of my windows overlooks the back end of your building. So it's like every day I see this reminder of like what happens. And all I can say is I'm really grateful that, you know, you started this all, and that that you are persevering and continuing with it, because, you know, like Chinatown is not just for people who live here. Chinatown means a lot to folks from all over who come to Chinatown, who are not just Chinese Americans, but come to Chinatown because they go shopping or they have connections here. You know, they get to see friends, or, you know, they pick up ingredients that they can't get anywhere else. And then they also get to come to your store. And there were so few places where people can just kind of sit, talk about books, enter a conversation about things that, you know, are near and dear to our hearts, whether it's about literature or it's about the fears of what's happening, you know, to the community under the pandemic, right? And different iterations of anti-Asian hatred. You know, you built this space where people feel comfortable coming and meeting and talking, and that's incredibly precious. And that's really what community is about. So you know, if I talk about, or I think about, oh, what did Chinatown mean for my family members when they first arrived here in the 19th century, right? Fleeing a lot of the violence that happened out west, with these different iterations of Chinese exclusion. And then they arrive in New York, and then they find a community. Well, you're part of this continuation of that, you know? Really. So I just, you know, I can't speak more highly of the things that your bookstore provides for the community.
I've never cried on the show before, but I think I might today.
Yeah, I'm just like under a blanket, like, yeah, for sure, like tearing up. Yeah, no problem. Like,
and even for me personally, you know, I was working on this book long before the pandemic happened. So I was dealing with the ways in which my family members were dealing with, you know, discrimination from the 19th century, and really feeling it personally, because it wasn't just a history lesson. It was the things that my family members were having to navigate that really impacted their lives, that made them move, right? That made them not feel safe in places that they were living out west in Northern California or Boise, Idaho. And then so anyway, so I was dealing with that, right? And all the emotional ups and downs of it. And then the pandemic happened. And then, you know, all of the iterations of people getting attacked. It was so horrible and scary and demoralizing. And there were moments where it's like, you know, you're feeling all these emotions, anger, pain, and then to be able to, you know, I'm working on this book, and it's a really heavy and difficult emotional landscape to navigate. And then I get to go to your bookstore, you know, around the corner, and just, you know, be like, oh, here, you know, like, have something to drink, or like, these new books came out. And, you know, it just, I mean, it's just being able to strike up conversations with folks who had, you know, just sort of randomly come in because they wanted to go to the bookstore. But then, you know, we're talking about books and the books that we love, and, you know, helping to hand sell different books.
Every time Ava comes in, like, by the way, just 15 copies of MOTT STREET fly off the wall.
Aww.
Like, every time she comes in, I'm like, okay, Ava's coming on Tuesday. Let's get a big order in, because she's going to sell through all of them while they're there. I love it. I love that all these authors like have, because I think it's hard to, like, especially authors that like look like us, come from our backgrounds, like, to find that sense of home and find that sense of companionship with all of these bookshelves that are somewhat reflections and also like doors to other stories too. So I feel really excited that you felt that way. Like I feel that way. Like I'm not an author myself, but I love books, and you know, like I was talking with a couple of my friends, like they all wrote books and they're like, yeah, I was in there and I saw Ava, and then like Ocean Bong came in and we were just like chatting, and they're like, I don't know what's happening, but like this is like a great vibe. And I was like, I don't know what's happening either, y'all. Like I don't know what happened, but I love it. I love it.
We're dropping links below to the store, even though you're in transition from one space to another. People can still buy books from you, can still support the store. You can pick up MOTT STREET. You can pick up any other book that you mentioned today from Lucy and you and me. So we're going to put them below. So MOTT STREET has been out for a couple months now. Congratulations, Ava. It's a wonderful book. I'm not the only one who thinks that. Obviously, Lucy keeps selling it, so she believes it too. Her customers believe it too. Publishers Weekly calls the book stunning. The New York Times calls it sensitive, ambitious, well-reported. Kirkus gave it a starred review, elegantly written and probing. Sweeping, says the LA Review of Books, and it goes on and on from all different other places. I really found the book to be such an important read about, well, your family story, but a story that really speaks to the human story of family and sacrifice and finding your way. Very much a story of America and our triumphs and our incredible flaws. I wonder if you could tell our audience a little bit about MOTT STREET. What is the book that you've written?
Sure. So MOTT STREET is about the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act laws on 4 generations of my family in New York's Chinatown. It traces their stories from the southern part of China to where they landed out in the American West. I have a railroad worker ancestor, so I get to talk about the railroad and what happened there. I get to talk about the tsunami of hatred, of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese hatred that happened after the railroad was completed. And I get to talk about what happened when my family did, like many Chinese families, did this reverse migration across the country and landed in the heart of the community on MOTT STREET. It's been a pleasure working on this book. It's been a really long journey. People have sometimes asked me, like, well, how long have you been working on the book? And the short answer is that, I've been working on the book solidly since 2015. But the real answer, the more in-depth answer, the more truthful answer is that I've really been working on this book ever since I was a little kid, listening to the stories that my grandfather told me about his grandfather, who worked on the nation's first transcontinental railroad, which physically united the country after the Civil War. And the book goes back to that period in time in the 19th century when our very young country was asking itself, who is an American and who is not? Who is one of us and who is not? And the decisions that they made back then really set us as a country on a course towards seeing all Asians as being suspicious, foreign, and not one of us, even though we've been here since practically forever, right? And so the great aim of the book is really to bring these stories, these Asian American stories, into the forefront, into the larger fabric of these American stories. The other aspect of the story is this building, right? So both sides of my family lived in the same tenement apartment building in the heart of the community as upstairs, downstairs neighbors from each other. And they had a long history of being neighbors, friends, rivals. They sent their kids to the same churches. They went to the same schools. They summered together in the same neighborhood on the Jersey Shore. But it was only until my parents got together several generations later that we all become family kin. So this building is like a womb for us all. And it was the central place where I could really tell the stories of the women in the family and their struggles and their triumphs. But it's also a place that provided a home for me too, because I have a writing studio here. And I actually grew up outside of Chinatown. I grew up in Queens, but as a child visiting Chinatown with my family, to go shopping, to eat, to visit extended family members, right? But it was only until I started working on this book and I started working on this book here that I really started to feel very much at home in this community, right? And I feel like, so this building offered a kind of refuge for me, for us. But I also feel like that was also Lucy's bookstore too, as a writer and as somebody who loves books. So there are like these different pockets of Chinatown that I felt very much at home in, and that was so important under the pandemic. When our community was under so much stress, and still is. So I have often said that I feel like the best thing that came out of this difficult time period for us, is that community and this sense of togetherness. And I know lots of Asian Americans and Chinese Americans who have felt the same way. They've reconnected with their roots and their heritage. They want to know more about these stories. They want to tell these stories, right? And it's important for our stories to get out there. So it's like important for like the young writers to write their stories. It's important for us who are maybe more established writers to help those young people, find their voices and amplify it. Absolutely. And so that's why it's so important also to have the bookstore selling the books. So it's all part of a piece of like this way that we're all interconnected here that I just love so much.
You write, I think it's in the introduction or the first chapter, you write about how MOTT Street is a ghost book, which I was really struck by. Can you explain what you mean by a ghost book?
So the first time I stepped into our building, okay, so I should also say, my family's lived here continuously since the building was built. And my Chin side of my family overtook the fourth floor. And then my Shin side of my family lived upstairs on the fifth floor, right? So there's a way that's like, if these walls could talk, right? And I feel it every single time I come into the building. And there have been moments where out of the corner of my eye, like I feel like I see somebody, right? Flashing past me in the hallway or in our living room, sitting, on the sofa. There's a way in which the very walls themselves, I feel like, contain the echoes of what came before. So I very much felt like I was talking to ghosts here. And I sometimes try not to talk about that too much because, I'm a professor, I'm an academic, and these are things that we don't talk about. But there were things that happened that are really kind of unexplained, from these connections that we have with the past and our ancestors who came before us.
I like that idea that you're building where you have this family connection, where you write now, the building is telling you stories. The building is sort of a living reminder to the past. And then Lucy's bookstore is also a home to all of those, to many, many stories, your family stories, other stories. And Lucy, I wonder if you can talk about the curation of what's in your bookstore. How do you choose which authors and books to feature? Do you have a guiding principle? Because clearly you're a destination and you're important to so many people. And that really has to come back to the vision that you have for the store. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think just to quickly piggyback off of Ava,
Please.
the store address is 44 Mulberry Street, and she very explicitly says the number 4 in Chinese is bad luck because 4 is very close to the name in Mandarin for death. So it was like but 4 plus 4 equals 8, and that's a really lucky number. But you know, when we're talking about ghosts and we're talking about generations of stories that kind of led to where we are and follow us, like, because inevitably we can't be where we are without those stories as well. The previous location of the bookstore was a funeral supply store as well. So 44 also very on brand for a funeral supply store, maybe not so on brand for a bookstore, but like, you know, altogether it's we're carrying this tradition forward. We're carrying our history forward in terms of our immigration stories. And from my perspective, the curation of the space is, yes, there's a large selection of Asian American authors, but I think there's also, because I'm Asian American, I think a lot of people are like, oh, it's an Asian American bookstore, but it's just a bookstore. Like, it's not any way geared one or another just based on my own identity. And I think that transferred or shared experience between immigrant stories is so important, and it adds a lot of complexity, and it adds a lot of like radical love and acceptance cross-culturally, which I think is very important for a place like Chinatown that has been so historical, has gone through so much change, and the stories that persevered there are completely parallel to a different immigrant story that can be shared in the same way. And I got very emotional reading some of those like cross-cultural connections and that radical love and acceptance within MOTT Street. Like, Ava, the way you weaved and brought so much love and light to the Black and Asian solidarity that has persisted into like the history of our stories, and also like the Jewish and Asian solidarity during very tumultuous times. I think that is some part of history I was never really taught in school.
Yeah.
And there's consistent efforts to quell that as well. And it's like, no, that's tied to why we're here. And without the people that had our backs, the people that related to us in these ways for being other, like, we wouldn't be here in the same way. So I carried that on and trying to create a store that reflected that, because I do think that kindness at the core of everything is really the building blocks of community.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Lucy, for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like wait a moment to like really digest that like we need much more kindness in all of our decisions that we make, all of the choices. And we have lost that. Or
yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I'm just such a cinnamon roll. Like I think we're all like cinnamon rolls. We're just like mushy inside looking for love. And I realize I also didn't answer your questions. Like,
that's okay.
I very much like curate my selection. I'm always on the lookout for new books that come out that really represent our identities in a comprehensive way. I think that a lot of times, especially writers of color, are brought to be educators of our experience. And that's something that I have to be mindful of in what's being pushed by publishing as well. So what's on the forefront, what's on the front list? Is it more of like, okay, what audience are you looking at? Are these authors really put on the front list because they're like, oh, they can teach us everything? And I think some of those books are very important as well, but where are the books that we're actually just sharing a story and our identity is part of it, but not the only thing selling the book?
The other thing that I thought you did really well in the book was shine a light on the stories of women in your family. You had mentioned this before as well, who we never would have known their stories. Like, men perhaps have more of a paper trail. They have a public life in this early part, late 1800s, early part of the 1900s. You know, men had outside jobs, they had lives, community roles, and women's were very much kept at home. And there were so many women in your family that you highlighted that I mean, I could have read a whole book about, and forgive me, now I can't remember if it's your great grandmother or great great grandmother, but Yulan.
Yeah, Yulan, the great grandmother. Yeah,
I loved her. And let's see, I have a whole list of here I want to highlight. So Elva, Yulan, Chun, Macklin, Rose, like all of these women in your family who brought women warriors. Yes, Grace, thank you. They had such brave stories. I mean, the thought of leaving your homeland and everything you know, you can't speak the language, you can't read, definitely not in English. And well, actually, Chun was a midwife, but you know, some of them had varying levels of educational background, but they left their families, traveled across the world, didn't know really what they were getting themselves into, and they had these amazing stories. Were these women you knew about when you began your process, or did you uncover them? Did you set out to highlight? Tell us a little bit about the way you approached which of your family members to highlight, because they were just also fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah. So I had a really hard time with this because I have a lot of family members, and many of them were connected to different things that happened that were important in the Asian American diaspora, right? And the Chinese American diaspora. So I was like, how do I pick and choose? Because I love them all, right? But what I realized is that I really did want to include the stories of the women. It was so important because you so rarely got to hear their stories. When I was in college and I remember the first time I read Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior. And I remembered how she brought to life the story of the ants, right? The no-name woman who is so shamed by the family in the village that she has just become a cautionary tale to the narrator, right? And then the narrator is like, no, I'm not going to perpetuate the silence. I'm going to tell her story. And I was so inspired by that as a young writer that I really sought out the stories of the women. Once I started asking a lot of questions of the people who remained, who were like their children, right? Or grandchildren. And so what happened is I was very, very lucky. Once I started making inquiries, and by the way, this was not an easy thing because I should mention that I was estranged from one side of my family throughout my entire childhood. And I was the family that I was closest to who raised me, they told me stories, but I didn't know the other side of my family. And it was hard, emotionally hard to bridge that gap. And what it took emotionally to meet my dad for the first time, and then to get information from that side of my family about our family members who influenced them and came before us. But I was lucky because as I started to just scratch the surface, all of this stuff came out. It turns out that the grandfather that I never met left an oral history at the local oral history project, the museum here, right? And people were written about. This grandfather left documents because he was working with all these young writers who he had the sense that there was a larger story than just our family story at work. And if these other writers hadn't kept that information, hadn't done these interviews, these oral histories with him, and hadn't kept like these volumes of papers that, these handwritten notes that my grandfather was writing to try to tell the story, I would not have been able to write that section of the story. And so he was very close to his mother. I was very lucky. And so he wrote about her, and so that's Yulan.
Your book really is a call to action for all of us to take the oral histories of our family members. I mean, really, I just sit down with your grandmother, your grandfather, your aunt, your uncle, and just record, use your iPhone, or whatever phone, take a half hour to record their stories, because all of this would have been lost. And what inspiring women they are.
Thank you. And you know what? It's easier to do this now than when I was doing it. When I was doing it, it was, I actually had to an actual little mini cassette recorder, and I had to schlep out to Salt Lake City to the genealogy library there and look up the census that way. These days it's get on Ancestry, you can record things on your phone, it's so much easier. So do it. I recommend anybody to do it.
And your research was very extensive. So you just mentioned that you went to Salt Lake City. So the Church of Latter-day Saints has this resource that it's open to the public, right? That you can go and sort of look in genealogy they collect the genealogy of sort of anyone, right?
Everyone.
And then you also went to Seattle. I know you went to Seattle, you went to China.
Yeah.
And many other places I'm sure I'm missing. You had a really exhaustive process of research.
Yeah.
Thinking about that now, what advice would you offer to someone who wants to write a nonfiction book about their family, or actually, any book about your family? What would be like your top, like, oh, I wish I had done this. This would have made my life easier.
I mean, my number one piece of advice is to start doing it now. Because from this vantage point, I can see I'm so grateful to young college aged and little girl Ava, who asked all those questions when I was a child, right? For the work that I did. The other piece is like, if you are going to do this now, use the family photo albums as an entry point into the story. Because people will start talking once they, like, who's this? Or, who's that person? Yeah. And start making those notes. And keep those notes in a place where you can find them again. Don't do it willy-nilly the way I did. I still, what happens with me? I'll pick up a book and I'll find notes that I wrote when I was in college. And it's like they come to you, but it's a lot easier if it's all like in one place.
Okay, so start now. Start now and be organized.
Yeah. And another piece of advice is really to, yes, as Grace says, she's heard me say this before, over food. When family members particularly Asian American families, get together over food, that's when they start spilling the stories.
And you can just put your phone right there in the middle of the table and hit record.
Yeah.
There you go. Grace actually has asked a question. Thank you, Grace. Grace asks, how do you balance your complex family history with love for your family and the wider Chinese American community? Some would probably have run away from their roots in your situation.
No. So I think, it's not an easy thing to do, to start asking questions. Particularly if you come from a family, as mine was, who didn't like to air the dirty laundry. There's this real feeling. I think if you come from a marginalized community that has been under pressure for so many decades, there's this feeling of you don't want to look bad. You don't want people on the outside the community to like see the things, see the dirty secrets, right? Don't make us look bad. But what I had to remember and what I had to tell people was this story is not just about any particular individual. It is about what happened to the larger community, and the impact on the larger community for such a long period of time. And once I started framing things in that way, I think people really started to understand. The other thing too, for me, that I had going for me is that, my grandfather was trying to tell the story and was trying to tell many stories, and he ran out of time. So what I reminded people was that I was just trying to finish what he started.
One of the points you make very successfully in this book, I felt for me as a reader, and I'm sure others will feel this way as well, is you really draw a through line from the first time an Asian person emigrated to the United States to some of the Asian hate that we're seeing, well, all of the Asian hate that we're seeing now, that there's this connection to how the Asian community has been treated in America from the very beginning. And I wondered, I imagine that was something, well, actually, let me rephrase it this way. Did you expect to make that connection when you sat down to do this history? Did you think, I'm going to talk about the Exclusion Act and it's going to show this sort of generations of racism and discrimination? It's just going to show us, it's going to be very obvious. Or was that something that came as you started to examine these stories and sift through the research and you realize that this has been a pattern for so long?
In the beginning, I was really just trying to tell and collect our family stories. But what started to happen is it became clearer and clearer as I started to do the research that all roads were leading me back to Chinese exclusion. And the way, the insidiousness of this legislation, I should just spell it out for, folks out there. Chinese exclusion halted our legal immigration into this country and blocked a pathway towards our citizenship for over 60 years. And it continued for 2 decades later until the 1965 Immigration Act, when our quotas were in the same equal numbers as other nationalities. So it lasted longer. It really was like an 80+ year period, right? And if you've got such a long period, that what that means if you can't become a citizen is that you can't professionalize, you cannot be a lawyer or a judge or a politician, you cannot vote out those laws. And what was heartbreaking for me was that I discovered when because I was like, how did this even happen in the first place? What was at the root of Chinese exclusion? Like, how did this happen, right? And the fact that it went back to around the time after the railroad was completed was so painful for me, because the stories of our ancestor who worked on the railroad were stories that were told with such pride by my grandfather. We had such family pride in the work that was done. And to realize that so soon after the railroad was completed, that this anti-Chinese sentiment was the sentiment that really enacted Chinese exclusion in the first place as the country's first federal immigration restriction. So painful. It's even painful for me to think about and talk about now, So it was hard. It was really, 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 really hard working on this book. And then when I realized that Chinese exclusion and this building was a framework to hang the story, these interesting stories of family members as they had to navigate it, that there was a frame for the story. I was doing this before the pandemic happened, right? And so it was like grappling with this the roots of this anti-Chinese sentiment. And then the pandemic happened, and we had the former administration and all their anti-Chinese rhetoric, and it was like, oh, I mean, I think that other people may have been caught unaware, but I think I was very much aware of the fact that the seeds of this hatred went all the way back to the 19th century. And so I think that it just made me write faster. So when I was seeing Lucy in the store, I was already like halfway through writing the book, but I was still grappling with, really how to structure everything and like what's more interesting for the reader, which character, what to include and what not to include. And so it was a real comfort to be able to get out of my own head and even get out of this building for a moment to go to a space where, people love to talk about stories.
I'd like to ask you both a story question. Thank you for setting that up so well. That was great. A couple of months ago, I did an online writing class with Alexander Chi. It's fantastic. I'm sure he's been to your bookstore. He's fantastic. And he was talking about writers and other people always talk about their influences. Like, oh, this is the author that influences my writing or influences my thinking. And his point was, actually, the writers who in the books that influence us are the ones we read in our childhood. They shape us as readers and writers and thinkers and booksellers. And so I'm curious to the two of you, lovers of books, lovers of stories, what were the books that you read in your childhood that were your favorite that you think shaped your view of storytelling? Or that made you love books and want to open a bookstore?
Ava, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
You go first, because I'm mulling over the childhood ones. I'm so enmeshed in the things that I read when I was a teenager and in college that I have to remember like those earlier books. So you go first.
I'll weave in some of my adult reads too.
Sure.
As a kid, I was really drawn to unconventional families because that's what mine looked like. And also incredibly drawn to friendships because later on, when I learned the terminology chosen family, it's made up with my closest friends that have become my family. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, one of my favorites, Kite Runner, Glass Castle, I just was absolutely obsessed with. And later in my life, like really, really books about friendships. I think maybe there is a big lack of that friendship representation when I was younger. So I read a lot of YA books, but recent favorites, Stay True, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, If I Had Your Face, all very focused on friendship. And I think that's something that I'm really like leaning into throughout my whole life, but right now, like focusing on literature about that.
Great. Amy, what about you?
So, okay, thank you, Lucy, for going first, because you reminded me of some of my favorite books when I was growing up that I was reading. Because of the way that I grew up, I was very much interested in stories of, like young people who were alone, sometimes by benign neglect and sometimes not, who were searching for something. So I was an only child. I grew up as a single mother. She was very busy. I had to keep myself busy. So Island of the Blue Dolphins, right? I was obsessed with the Madeleine L'Engle books. A Wrinkle in Time was very important to me because also here's a young girl going out looking for her father, right? So the missing parent thing, because I was raised by a single mom and didn't know my dad until I was in my mid-20s, which I write about in MOTT Street,
Yep.
right? That was really like the beginning of my really searching out, like who is this family that I didn't know? Who were they in relation to each other? And how were we all interconnected here, in the space in Chinatown, in these time periods. So so those were really important books for me. And then, Maxine Town Kingston's Woman Warrior and China Men, I couldn't get enough of. It's one of those Woman Warrior is one of those books that I go to time and time. I return to time and time again because it seemed the way she writes is so clear, and it seems so simple is not the right word, like just clear, right? And easy to get into. But there's so much there. And what I realized too, looking back after having done all of this research about Chinese exclusion, there are the imprint of Chinese exclusion is in all of Maxine's books, whether she explicitly states it or not. And I always have a fun time talking to my students because I teach those books, like, where do you think, which she's offering a couple of stories here about, how the dad comes over. Which one do you think is true? And why did she have to offer multiple versions of the truth? And so then we get into a great conversation about immigration in this country.
Those are great recommendations. Yeah. Those are great look backs. Thank you. Lucy, what's popular in the store other than MOTT Street?
MOTT Street, obviously. Some of our bestsellers, Kappa, Kappa. It's a translated short, very, very short novella. It's been one of our bestsellers. The Sorrows of Others, Ada Zhang's really popular. Stay True, consistently bestseller. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, bestseller. Cursed Bunny is really popular as well. And I'm trying to think So we were big fans of A Place for Us. So we just keep slinging that book nonstop. And Open Water is really popular as well.
Excellent. What will the store look like in a year from now when you kind of set your dream forward? I read an interview that said you only plan 2 weeks out.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I only plan 2 weeks out.
Maybe you have to have changed that by now.
No, because why? I mean, I couldn't have predicted a fire would happen July 4th. And if I had planned a year out, I would have to have restructured not only my current status of reality, but also all that I have built in my head. So I just removed that part of the equation of not building a head in my head. But I can talk about my excitements for what the community is going to look like and how I'm going to push the extensions of that and how are we going to really like bring You and Me books bigger and larger than the space that we can offer, and how can we stay connected with the schools in the community, the other organizations in a way that's very creative and more integral. I think there's like hopes and dreams to think bigger than where we are right now, which is very logistics focused. And I'm leaving a lot of room for myself to surprise myself in the ways that I think of that as well.
Is the space you're in now, excuse me, the space you're in now that you're building shelves for, that you'll open later this month, it's a temporary space until the end of the year. And then is the hope that you return to your previous space in January?
Yeah, exactly. So we're at the Market Line, 115 Delancey Street, stall number 11. And we'll be here until the end of December. And the initial contracting timeline that they gave for the store was 1 year of shutdown. And through sheer willpower alone, I'm going to try to get it up and running by January. So that's the hope. I know. It's just, I walked by Chinatown yesterday, obviously to get all of my supplies from KK Discount. And I don't know, there is like a heartbeat there that I'm really, really drawn to. And without it, I feel pretty untethered. I'm trying to bring that heartbeat wherever I go, whether it be the Market Line, whether it be the pop-ups that we have, but that historical significance and, my family story that looks very different from Ava's, but has its own parallel path in a lot of ways as an only child raised by a single mother. All of these connections are so prominent in Chinatown, and I can't wait to kind of bring more warmness to that.
We can't wait till you come back.
I mean,
you're there, but closer.
I know. Soon. Lucy, your story is really very inspiring. I mean, I think many of us are scared to try for our dreams, right? Where opening a bookstore is scary at any time, but definitely during a pandemic. And I know I personally am a person who can always talk myself out of doing something like, oh, that's too hard, and so the fact that you went forward to fulfill this vision that you had for so long is itself amazing. And that you have found such a home and so much support and love. I mean, I think that just speaks to the power of pursuing your dream. I'm like losing my voice because I'm so overcome. But it's really, we've had so many booksellers on the show, and everyone works hard. It is a difficult job, but it is also a role in our communities that is so necessary. We all need a place to belong, to find ourselves on the shelf, to learn about new things, right? To learn new stories. I mean, I think we're talking about Ava's book, MOTT STREET, and it's very much Ava's family story, but it is a universal story as well about a new land, a new life, about sacrifice, about loss, about hope. And, we all need that. So,
I mean,
keep going.
Thank you so much. I'll just say one thing. Like, I love what I do, and not for a second I regret it. It doesn't stop being hard, There are times that it gets hard too. And I'm literally the other day I was on the phone with my mom and I was crying, like snot ugly cry moment. And I was just like, why is it all so hard? Like it all feels so hard. And she's like, you're swimming against the current and you get tired. And like today, if you need a rest, just lie down. And I think that, you know, I feel whatever version of the store it's in right now, 1.5, 2, I don't know. I'm really proud of myself because it doesn't feel easy because it's not, but nothing's easy.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've given my full heart to everyone that I've interacted with. And I felt that times 10 reflected back. And I just realized it's not that hard to grow your heart. So
Yeah.
I'm really, really grateful. Like I'm just happy to sling books, you know? And I'm really, really so grateful to be here. And Ava, like, I cannot wait to like, actually like, you know, throw a whiskey shot at you.
Me too. You know what you're reminding me of too, and this is something I think Kimberly you asked, or maybe Grace in the chat asked this question. You know, how do we continue to do these things that are really hard but are important and necessary, not just for ourselves but for other people and for the community? And I think that one of the most important things that I learned from working on this book and seeing it from, you know, the start to completion is that there's a way in which you have to learn how to hold all of these feelings inside yourself and in your heart, like having space in your heart for the difficult moments, the joyful moments, the moments that you know, make you really angry, and others that make you weep. And maybe that's part of, you know, like growing with, you know, the times. And that if you can maintain that and enough space for all of those things, then you really can make amazing things happen.
Perfect. But I do have one last question. Lucy, this one's for you. Lucy, we always ask the booksellers this question. Please finish this sentence for us. Please finish the sentence for us. Running a successful bookstore is part hard work, part luck, and part what else?
And all the way heart.
And all the way heart. Thank you both so much for being with us today. I knew this was going to be a wonderful conversation, and it absolutely has been. Everyone, please go pick up MOTT STREET. Pick it up from You and Me Books. Here, Ava's going to show us this wonderful cover. Lucy has it too. And we're going to links below to pick up your copy of MOTT STREET. This is such a great story, an important story. Perfect if you're an early bird holiday shopper. You could get a head start and have it ready to give out to everybody you know. If you like today's show, thank you very much, Grace, for watching today and for your comments. If you like today's show, we certainly hope that you did. Please subscribe to Mighty Blaze on Facebook to get notified about all of our other interviews. If you're not a Facebook person, hop over to our website, mightyblaze.com, to sign up for our newsletter. And it goes out once a week, gives you the rundown of all of the shows that are happening. We will be back, Authors Love Bookstores. We'll be back next Wednesday, September 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. I will be sitting down with author Mike Gale, who will be tuning in from the UK. So please put that on your calendar. And until then, be well and keep reading. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.